In the fall of 1983, in a county in central Kansas, where the grain elevators stand taller than anything the churches ever built, a 62-year-old woman discovered that the man she had trusted for 13 years had taken every dollar she had earned in a season and vanished across a state line. She had $11.40 left to her name. What she did not know yet, standing in a bank with her hands on the counter and nothing in the account that should have held $84,200, was that the answer to everything that had just happened was already in her house. It had been sitting on a kitchen shelf for 12 years, written in her dead father's handwriting. Inside a water-damaged notebook that no one in the entire agricultural establishment of the state of Kansas would have recognized as worth anything at all. It was worth everything. October 1983, Barton County, Kansas. The air that morning carried the smell of turned milo stalks and diesel exhaust, and the faint mineral bite of early frost. Cold that arrives in the plains before it is welcome, before the harvest is entirely finished. Settling into the low places between the fields and staying there like something that has decided it belongs. Marjorie Hollister was 62 years old. She had worked this particular ground in central Kansas for 38 of those years. First beside her father on the South 40, when he was still strong enough to walk every row before sunrise, and again after dark. Then beside him and a partner in the final months of her father's life, when a man named Dalton Giddon came on to handle the books and the phone calls and the business that Marge had no patience for. And then with Giddon alone for 12 years after her father died. A partner she had trusted with the accounting, with the banking, with the parts of the operation that happened indoors and on paper rather than outdoors and in the soil, which in retrospect was the decision a person makes when she is good at growing things and assumes that being good at growing things means she can judge the character of the man standing next to her while she does it. She walked the fields the way women walk when the land has shaped their bodies over decades. Not fast, not slow. Each step placed with a slight forward lean, as though she were testing the ground before committing her weight to it. She carried a folding knife in her left breast pocket, the same knife her father had used to cut seed kernels and test their moisture content. And she checked it out of habit the way other people check the time. That morning, she had driven the 40 minutes south and west to the Great Bend branch of First Central Bank of Kansas to deposit the harvest receipts from the season's grain sorghum, $84,200 in certified checks. The product of 6 months of shared labor and 30 years of built soil. Split per the partnership agreement she and Dalton Giddon had drawn up and signed in the fall of 1970. The checks were supposed to have cleared the joint operating account by the second week of September. They had not. The account balance was $0. She stood at the teller's window for a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not grip the counter. She did not do any of the things a person might expect a 62-year-old woman to do when she discovers that everything she earned in a season has been taken by the one person who had the authority to take it. She asked to speak with the branch manager. His name was Estes. Young, soft handshake, striped tie. He confirmed what the screen already showed. The account had been emptied. Wire transfer initiated 5 days prior. Authorized by Dalton Giddon as co-signatory under the partnership's banking agreement. Routed to an account in Tulsa, Oklahoma that Marge had never heard of. And then Estes said the second thing. He said there was also the matter of a loan. $38,000, secured against the farm's equipment inventory. Filed 3 months ago under the partnership's operating authority. Signed by Dalton Giddon. Disbursed to the same Tulsa account. Marge looked at him. She said nothing for what Estes would later describe to his wife as the longest 4 seconds of his professional career. Because here is what $38,000 secured against equipment means to a woman who farms 160 acres alone. It means the bank owns your tractor, your cultivator, your grain drill, your harrow. Every piece of metal that stands between you and working the ground with your bare hands. And if you do not pay it back in 90 days, they come and take it. All of it. She had $11.40 in her personal checking account. She had a farm with no debt on the land itself. And she had just learned that the man she had trusted for 13 years had not only stolen her harvest, he had leveraged her tools against her future and walked away with both. She said, "How long do I have on the equipment loan?" Estes said, 90 days from the date of default notice, which was mailed last week. She said, "I see." She drove home. She sat in her truck in the driveway for 23 minutes. She could see the north field from the windshield. 160 acres of harvested ground. The stubble rose running east to west in the long October light. The same field her father had plowed when he was alive. The same field she had plowed after he was gone. The same field Dalton Giddon had walked across 1,000 times wearing pressed shirts and talking about commodity futures as though talking about them was the same thing as understanding them. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Not because she was angry, because her hands needed something to hold while the rest of her caught up. She got out of the truck and walked to the field's edge and stood there. And she made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not the kind that looks good in a movie. The kind that happens inside a woman who has spent 62 years learning that the world does not arrange itself around what you deserve. It arranges itself around what you do next. She was not going to chase Dalton Giddon. She was not going to call the sheriff. She was not going to drive to Tulsa and stand on somebody's porch and demand an explanation from a man who had already explained himself perfectly well by leaving. She was going to solve the problem in front of her, which was she had 83 days to either pay $38,000 she did not have or lose every piece of equipment that made her farm operational. And she had $11.40 to do it with. Dalton Giddon had not left quietly. That was what people said in the days after. When the story moved through Great Bend and Ellenwood and Pawnee Rock the way news moves in a small county. Person to person, at the co-op, at the coffee counter of the Quick Shop on 10th Street, at the grain elevator where men leaned against truck fenders and talked about other people's trouble because it was easier than talking about their own. He had not crept away. He had signed the wire transfer on a Tuesday, driven to his house on the north side of town, loaded a U-Haul trailer in the afternoon, and was across the Oklahoma line before Wednesday morning. He left the office keys on Marge's kitchen counter and did not leave a note. People who knew Giddin said he was easy company, the kind of partner who handled the accounting and the telephone calls and the co-op meetings with the easy confidence of a man who considered his own competence self-evident. He wore pressed shirts to meetings where every other person wore denim. He drove a Chevy Silverado that was newer than his income should have allowed. In retrospect, the arithmetic of that truck should have told somebody something. Except nobody does that math. Nobody looks at the man handling the books and says your truck costs more than your share of the sorghum. Because that would require admitting that you trusted someone without verifying, and admitting that is harder than losing the money. Marge knew this. She had known Dalton Giddin since the fall of 1970. Her father, Eldon Hollister, was already failing by then. The cancer had started in his lungs that summer and moved into his bones by September. He could no longer walk the fields before sunrise the way he always had. He could no longer lift a seed bag or climb onto the tractor seat without help. And he was the one who had said they needed a partner, someone to handle the business side, someone to manage the books and the phone calls and the co-op paperwork so Marge could focus on what she was good at. Giddin had come on that October. Eldon had signed the partnership agreement himself, witnessed it in the margin in his own handwriting. And 4 months later, in February of 1971, Eldon Hollister was dead. Marge had never blamed her father for bringing Giddin in. Eldon had been dying. He wanted to know that his daughter would not have to run the business side alone. And Giddin had seemed decent, which he was, until he wasn't. 3 weeks after Giddin left, Marge drove to the Barton County Extension Office on 10th Street in Great Bend and asked to meet with the county agricultural agent, a man named Perry Yarbrough. Yarbrough was 34 years old, university trained at Kansas State. He believed with the thoroughness of a man who had never needed to question it that the standard rotation for central Kansas, milo, winter wheat, milo, was the correct framework for a small producer trying to survive a difficult decade. He was not wrong about the difficulty of the decade. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Marge sat across his desk and explained the situation without elaboration. She did not mention the equipment loan. She did not describe the 23 minutes in the truck or the way the steering wheel had felt under her hands. She said, "I need to look at what I can grow on 160 acres with very limited input capital." Yarbrough looked at her with a practiced patience, a specific patience that contains within it the assumption that the person across the desk needs to be managed rather than heard. And when that person is a woman, a 62-year-old woman sitting alone in a county extension office, asking about alternative crops. The assumption doubles. He said, "Marge, the bank has programs specifically for situations like yours. You don't need to reinvent the wheel." Two people were waiting in the outer office. One of them was a young man from Claflin named Colt Nesmith. He was 26 years old. He had a seed catalog on his knee and a look on his face that suggested he was hearing more than he was supposed to. He looked up when Yarbrough said the word wheel. Yarbrough opened a 3-ring binder and turned it toward Marge. It showed commodity price projections for 1984. Milo, winter wheat. Milo. The same cycle on the same page in the same binder that every extension agent in central Kansas had been turning toward every distressed farmer for 20 years. He said, "Milo's your best bet even with input loans. Any alternative crop is a gamble and you can't afford a gamble right now." He said it with genuine conviction. He believed it. Not malicious, just thoroughly certain, and certain in a way that made the certainty feel like kindness. Marge looked at the projections for a moment. She said, "I appreciate that." She took nothing from the desk. She drove home, and somewhere between 10th Street and the county road that led to her driveway between the grain elevator and the section marker, and the last curve before the house came into view, she stopped being the woman who had just been told what she couldn't do, and became the woman who was about to decide what she could. Her father, Eldon Hollister, had died in February of 1971, 12 years before any of this happened. He had farmed the same Barton County ground since 1946 and left behind 3 things when he died: the land itself, debt-free, every acre, a John Deere 60 tractor that was already 18 years old at the time of his death and still ran like it had an opinion about stopping, and a composition notebook with a green cover and water-damaged corners that he had kept since 1949. The notebook was not organized. It was a record of whatever Eldon had noticed. Rainfall figures by month, soil observations written in margins so small, the handwriting tilted sideways to fit. A sketch of a drainage tile installation in the northwest corner, drawn with the precision of a man who cared more about getting it right than getting it pretty. Germination percentages for different seed lots. Notes on wind direction and what it did to topsoil. Marge had kept it on the kitchen shelf in a tin box for 12 years. She had read parts of it many times, but not all of it, not carefully, not the way you read something when you need it to save your life. Among the pages dated 1963 and 1964, in handwriting that grew smaller as the idea inside it grew larger, were 23 pages about grain amaranth. Eldon Hollister had grown up in Taos County, New Mexico. As a young man, he had watched the Tiwa-speaking farmers near the Pueblo grow grain amaranth in marginal dry soil. No irrigation, no synthetic nitrogen, no herbicide, and produce yields that made no sense when set against their inputs. He had carried seed back with him to Kansas in 1946. He grew it on a small test plot behind the barn for 3 seasons. The yields were modest, approximately 1,200 pounds per acre in poor conditions. But the input cost was nearly nothing. The plant fixed its own competition with weeds, handled drought better than any commodity crop he knew, and left the soil in better condition than it found it. He stopped growing it in 1949, not because it failed, because there was no buyer. He had written in the notebook, in handwriting that Marge recognized the way she recognized the sound of her own breathing. The plant knows how to grow. The problem is, people don't know what it is. Marge sat at the kitchen table and read the 23 pages twice. The light from the east window moved across the floor while she read. She did not get up. She did not make coffee. She read it the way a woman reads something her father wrote 30 years ago that suddenly sounds like it was written for this exact morning. And then she turned to the last page of the amaranth section and found something she had never seen before, because it was written in different ink, darker. The pen pressed harder into the paper. Dated 1968, 5 years after the main entries. Added in the margin and then continuing onto the back of the page in handwriting that was more careful than the rest. As though Eldon had wanted to make sure whoever read it would understand that this was not speculation. This was instruction. Companion planting method. Learned from Wayland Bernal at Taos Pueblo Summer, 1948. Amaranth planted in alternating rows with native bee plant at 8-inch spacing creates a natural weed suppression cycle. Bee plant fixes nitrogen into the top 4 inches of soil during the first 6 weeks. Amaranth uptake begins at week 7. Protein content in grain heads tested markedly higher than monoculture plots. 3 consecutive seasons confirmed 1948 through 1950. And below that, in the same dark ink, the same deliberate hand. Do not tell the partner. This knowledge belongs to the land and to the person who understands the land. Marge read that line 3 times. Do not tell the partner. In 1968, 2 years before Dalton Giddon ever set foot on this property, her father had written, "Do not tell the partner," as though he already knew, already sensed that whatever help would eventually come through the door would bring its own kind of risk, and that some knowledge needed to be kept separate from the arrangement, protected, hidden in a notebook on a shelf in a tin box where the business side of the operation would never think to look. And Marge had never shown Giddon the notebook. Not because her father had told her not to. She had not read that line until this moment. She had never shown Giddon the notebook because it was private, because it was her father's, because some things belonged to the person who kept them and the person they were kept for, and nobody else. But now the question opened inside her like a crack in dry ground. Had Giddon known about the notebook? Had he looked for it? Had 13 years of partnership been 13 years of a man waiting for something he believed was hidden in this house? She did not know. She could not know. Not yet. But the question was there. and it would stay there. She put the notebook down and stood up. She walked to the back corner of the machine shed. Cold in there. The smell of oil and old iron and the faint sweetness of grain dust that never fully leaves a Kansas farm building. She moved aside a stack of fence posts and 2 empty fuel cans and found what she was looking for. 2 coffee cans. Maxwell House. Sealed at the top with wax paper and rubber bands. Stored in the back corner of the machine shed since 1964. Her father's amaranth seed. She had found these cans in 1978 while cleaning the shed. She had not thrown them away. She would later describe this as the only decision in the whole affair that she had not made deliberately. She had simply set them back where they were because they had been there, and things that have been somewhere for a long time develop a kind of authority that makes moving them feel like an act of disrespect. She carried them to the kitchen. She opened the first can. The seeds were small. Smaller than she expected, like grains of fine sand, copper-colored. They shifted when she tilted the can and made a sound like dry rain. She tested the seed that evening. She soaked 50 grains from each can in damp paper towels inside a mason jar on the kitchen windowsill. She wrote the date in the notebook below her father's last entry. November 14th, 1983. And then she waited. 9 days. She checked the jar every morning before she went outside, and every evening when she came back in. The kitchen smelled of damp paper and something faintly mineral, like wet stone. On the 9th day, she counted. 31 of the 100 had germinated. She wrote the number in the notebook, 31 over 100. A 31% germination rate on 19-year-old seed stored in an uncontrolled environment in a Kansas machine shed was not a number that inspired confidence. It was not a number you would show a bank. It was not a number Perry Yarbrough would have looked at without saying the word gamble. But it was a number. And numbers told you what you were working with rather than what you wished you had. And what Marge was working with was this 31 seeds out of 100 that had refused to die for 19 years in a coffee can in the dark. Which was more than she could say for some partnerships she had been part of. By 1983, grain amaranth was not a recognized commodity crop anywhere in Kansas. The USDA had no price floor for it. The major exchanges did not list it. It existed in a space between what the agricultural establishment acknowledged and what the ground itself was willing to produce. A space that had no name and no infrastructure and no one standing in it except a 62-year-old woman with a jar of sprouted seeds on her windowsill. But Marge had done something else before the money disappeared. Something she had not told anyone about. In August 1983, 2 months before Giddon emptied the account, she had driven to the Barton County Public Library and found a paper published in 1982 by the Tillman Research Institute in eastern Pennsylvania. The paper suggested that amaranth might be among the highest protein grains in the world, with amino acid profiles that approached the nutritional value of conventional animal protein. She had photocopied it, filed it in her father's notebook behind the 23 handwritten pages about the plant, put the notebook back on the kitchen shelf, and done nothing with it, because at the time she had a partner and a harvest and a functioning operation, and the paper was interesting but not urgent. Now it was urgent. She read it again at the kitchen table. She read her father's notes again. She looked at the 31 germinated seeds in the mason jar. She looked at the line from 1968 about companion planting and protein content. She looked at the research paper's data on amino acid profiles. And something connected. Not dramatically, not with a flash of insight. The way things connect for a woman who has spent 62 years working the same ground. Slowly. One fact pressing against another until the shape between them becomes visible. Her father had known this plant produced exceptional protein. The Research Institute had confirmed it 30 years later. And her father had known a specific technique that made the protein content even higher. She had the seed. She had the technique. She had the research. She had 160 acres of ground that knew how to grow this plant because it had grown it before. What she did not have was money, or time, or anyone who believed this was anything other than the desperate last idea of a woman who had been cleaned out by her own partner. She drove back to the bank on a Monday morning. She asked for Estes. She did not sit down. She stood at his desk and said, "I want an extension on the equipment recovery timeline. 6 months instead of 90 days. Estes said, "Marge, the loan terms are clear." She said, "The land is free and clear. 160 acres with no lien. I have 38 years of continuous production history on that ground without a single missed season. You know that because your bank has held my account for every one of those years." Estes looked at her. She said, "I am not asking you to forgive the debt. I am asking you to give me 6 months to pay it. And I am asking you to consider that a woman who has farmed the same ground for 38 years without borrowing a dollar is probably not the worst risk you have on your books right now." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. He looked at the papers on it. He looked back at Marge. He said, "I can give you 6 months, but if the balance isn't resolved by April, we proceed." She said, "April is fine." She drove home. She spent the winter planning, not guessing, not hoping, planning. She pulled the 3 additional references she had found at the county library. An extension bulletin from Colorado State published in 1979. A trade catalog from a natural food seed company in Nebraska. A brief mention in an organic farming journal. She spread them across the kitchen table alongside her father's notebook and the research paper and the germination results and a hand-drawn map of her 160 acres with soil types marked from memory. She could not afford commercial seed at $14 per pound, so she wrote a letter instead. She wrote to the Tillman Research Institute in Pennsylvania. She described her test results, her soil type, her rainfall average, her father's successful cultivation on the same ground 30 years earlier. She described the companion planting technique from the 1968 notebook entry. She wrote it in the clear, plain language of a woman who had never needed to make things sound more complicated than they were. 3 weeks later, a padded envelope arrived. 2 pounds of improved amaranth seed, a variety they had been selectively developing for dryland conditions, and a handwritten note from a researcher named Luella Paget that said, "Your father's companion planting data is the first field confirmation we have seen of the protein enhancement we have been theorizing about in controlled conditions. Let us know your soil data. We are looking for dryland test sites in the Great Plains." Marge read the note twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box on the kitchen shelf next to her father's notebook. Her father had known. In 1948, in 1949, in 1950. He had watched the Tiwa farmers and understood what the institutional research world would not confirm for another 34 years. And he had written it down and put it in a notebook. And the notebook had sat on a shelf in a tin box, waiting. For what? For this. For exactly this. April 1984. She planted a 1/4-acre test plot using the smallest cultivator attachment on the John Deere 60. The row spacing she needed was 8 inches, 2 inches narrower than the machine's standard minimum adjustment. So she fabricated custom steel spacers at a shop in Hoisington and spent 4 hours in the machine shed modifying the cultivator attachment by hand. Her hands were stiff from cold that had not yet left the mornings. The metal was cold. The wrench slipped twice. She did not stop. She planted the 1/4 acre in one afternoon. The soil smelled of early season moisture and turned clay, and the amaranth seed was so small, like a grain of fine sand, copper-colored. She could feel it shifting in the seed box, even in the low wind that came off the fields from the northwest. She planted the companion rows as her father had described, alternating, 8-inch spacing, native bee plant between the amaranth rows, exactly as the Tiwa farmers had taught him 36 years before. She did not tell anyone what it was. Her neighbor to the south, Garland Mays, drove past on the county road in late April and stopped at the fence post. He sat in his truck with the window down and the engine running and looked at the planted 1/4 acre with an expression Marge had seen on the faces of men in this county her entire life. The expression of a man who is managing his opinion of a woman's decision and choosing to keep most of it to himself. He called across to her, "What you putting in over there?" It was not quite a question. It was an invitation for her to explain herself. The way men in Barton County invited women to explain themselves when they did something that did not fit inside the binder at the extension office. Marge straightened up from the row she was checking. She had dirt on her knees and under her fingernails and in the creases of her palms. She said, "Something my dad grew." Garland Mays looked at the field for a long moment. Then he drove on. That evening the phone rang. It was Laureen, her sister, calling from Wichita. Lorene was the only person who had known the full situation from the October morning when Marge had sat in her truck looking at the harvested North Field. She had driven out the weekend after it happened and sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything without interrupting, and then said, "What do you need?" And when Marge said, "Nothing yet," Lorene had nodded and driven back to Wichita. But tonight her voice was different, tight in a way that Marge recognized. She said, "Marge, I need to tell you something." Marge said, "Go ahead." Lorene said, "A friend of mine knows someone in Hutchinson. Dalton Giddon has been in Hutchinson for 3 weeks. He is telling people that you are going under, that the farm will be in foreclosure by spring, that the equipment is already in recovery." Marge was quiet. Lorene said, "He is telling people the land will be available." Marge looked out the kitchen window. The 1/4 acre she had planted that afternoon was not visible from here, but she knew where it was. She could feel where it was the way she could feel the edge of her own property line without looking at a survey map. She said, "Available." Lorene said, "He is waiting for you to fail, and he is positioning himself to buy the land when you do." The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall above the stove ticked. The tin box sat on the shelf with the notebook inside it. The mason jar with the germination test was still on the windowsill, empty now, cleaned, but still there. Marge said, "Then he is going to be waiting a long time." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a while. She did not sit down. She did not make coffee. She just stood there, in her own kitchen, in her own house, on her own land, holding the counter with both hands, the way she had held the steering wheel in the truck on that October morning. Because here is what Dalton Giddon did not know. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know about the 23 pages. He did not know about the companion planting technique or the research confirmation or the 2 pounds of improved seed sitting in a paper bag on the kitchen counter. He did not know that the woman he had stolen from was standing in her kitchen at 9 o'clock at night in Barton County, Kansas, with dirt still under her fingernails from planting something he had never heard of. Something her father had carried in his hands from New Mexico in 1946. Something that had been waiting in 2 coffee cans in the back of a machine shed for 19 years. He did not know any of this because he had spent 13 years looking at the books instead of looking at the ground. And the ground was where the answer had been the entire time. Outside in the dark, in a 1/4 acre of freshly planted soil, 31 seeds per 100 were deciding whether 19 years in a coffee can had been long enough to forget how to grow, or whether they remembered. Marge turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She would find out in July. By July, the amaranth stood 4 feet high. She had planted the 1/4 acre with her father's seed, the old seed, the 19-year-old seed from the coffee cans. Because the 2 pounds of improved stock that Luella Paget had sent were too valuable to risk on a test plot. You do not spend your best ammunition learning whether the rifle still fires. You use what you can afford to lose. And what Marge could afford to lose was a handful of copper-colored seeds that had already spent 19 years deciding whether they were still alive. 31% of them had decided yes, and that 31% was now standing in a quarter-acre of central Kansas ground in the dead middle of summer. Thick-stalked, deep green, with seed heads forming at the crown of each plant in a red so dark it looked like something the earth had been keeping secret and had finally let reach the surface. She walked the quarter-acre every morning, before sunrise, before the wind came up, when the dew was still on the seed heads and the light was the color of old brass. She checked plant spacing, counted seed head density per row, pressed the seed heads between her fingers the way her father had described in the notebook, feeling for moisture, for weight, for the specific firmness that meant the grain inside was filling. The companion rows of native bee plant had done what the notebook said they would do. The nitrogen fixation was visible in the color of the amaranth leaves. Darker green than she expected. Healthier. The bee plant itself had finished its cycle by mid-June and lay between the rows like a living mulch, suppressing weeds without being asked, feeding the soil without being told. It was, she thought, exactly what her father had written it would be. The smell of the field in late summer was unlike anything else she had ever grown. Dusty and faintly sweet, with an undertone of iron that she associated with the red pigment in the stalks. She would stand at the edge of the quarter-acre some evenings after the work was done and just breathe it in. Not because it was pleasant, because it was specific. It smelled like something that knew what it was. She harvested the quarter-acre in late August 1984 and weighed the cleaned grain in her kitchen. 34 pounds. On an annualized acre projection that was 136 pounds per acre. Far below what she needed. Far below what her father's notes suggested was possible. Far below what would justify expanding to the acreage required to make this work. The problem was the seed. 19 years old, 31% germination, which meant 69% of every row was empty ground producing nothing. Thin density cost her yield, and thin yield cost her the argument she would eventually need to make to herself about whether this was a plan or a prayer. But she had the improved seed now. 2 pounds of it. Bred for exactly these conditions. And she had something else. Something the 34 pounds of grain had given her that no amount of planning could have produced. She had proof that the technique worked. The companion planting had performed. The bee plant had fixed nitrogen on schedule. The amaranth had responded with deeper color and heavier seed heads than the monoculture test rows she had planted as a control along the east edge, even with 69% germination failure, even with seed that was older than some of the fence posts on her property. The method her father had learned from the Tiwa farmers in 1948 had done what he said it would do. 34 pounds was not enough to sell. But it was enough to know. She spent the fall of 1984 solving the first problem. The money problem. The $38,000 that Dalton Giddon had borrowed against her equipment and left her to pay back. She had until April. Estes had given her 6 months, and 6 months had sounded like a long time in October. It did not sound like a long time now. She walked the entire farm with a clipboard and a pencil and wrote down every piece of equipment she owned, every implement, every attachment, every spare part, everything that was not the John Deere 60 tractor and the cultivator she had modified for 8-inch row spacing. Because those 2 machines were the operation, everything else was negotiable. She sold the second grain drill to a farmer in Rice County for $2,200. She sold the disc harrow to a man in Hoisington for $1,800. She sold a stack of steel fence posts and 2 rolls of barbed wire and a set of truck tires she had been saving and a hay rake she had not used in 3 years. Each sale was a small piece of the farm leaving. Each check was a small piece of the debt disappearing. She recorded every transaction in a separate ledger she started specifically for this purpose. Date, item, buyer, amount, running balance of the debt. By December, she had reduced the balance to $19,000, and then she started selling compost. She had been building compost windrows in the South Shelter Belt for years. It was something she did because her father had done it, because the soil needed organic matter returned to it after every harvest, because you could not take from the ground forever without giving something back. She had never thought of it as a product. She had thought of it as a responsibility. But 3 neighboring farms had asked her about it over the years, because her compost was better than theirs, more thoroughly decomposed, better particle structure, a specific dark crumble that you could feel between your fingers. And she had always said no, because she needed it. Now she needed the money more. She sold compost through the winter of 1984 into early 1985, loading it herself, delivering it in the bed of her pickup, $40 a cubic yard. It was not dignified work for a 62-year-old woman with a bad left knee and a farm to run. But dignity is a thing you can set down when you need both hands for something else. And Marge needed both hands. By March 1985, the equipment debt was paid, every dollar. She drove to the bank and watched Estes mark the account clear and felt nothing she would have been able to describe to another person. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more like the feeling of setting down a heavy object you have been carrying across a room that turned out to be longer than you thought. She drove home. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the east window, looking at the north field. Then she planted. April 1985. 6 acres. The improved seed from Luella Paget, planted at 8-inch spacing with companion rows of native bee plant. Exactly as her father had described. Exactly as she had tested on the 1/4 acre. Except now the soil had been amended with 4 months of compost she had turned by hand every morning before sunrise through a winter that dropped to 6 degrees above zero in January and stayed there. 4 months. 2 hours every morning. In the dark. In cold, that went through her coat and her gloves and her boots and settled into her knees and her lower back and stayed there the way the cold stays in the low places of the fields. She turned the compost with a pitchfork because the manure spreader needed new wheel bearings and she could not afford the parts. The compost smelled of wet straw and decomposed grain husks and something faintly mineral, like river clay. She spread it in February using the manure spreader she had rebuilt the wheel bearings on during the first week of the new year. Working in the machine shed with a kerosene heater that produced more smell than warmth. Her hands cracked in the cold. She wrapped them in electrical tape when the skin split along her knuckles. She did not mention this to anyone. The 6 acres went in over 2 days in mid-April. The soil was better than it had been the year before. She could feel it. The compost had changed the structure. Looser, more moisture retention. The seed settled into the rows with a consistency that the quarter-acre test had not achieved. And then she waited again. By July, the 6 acres stood chest high. The seed heads were enormous, dense with grain capsules that swelled through the summer heat. The companion planting was performing at a level she had not seen even on the test plot. The native bee plant had created a nitrogen layer in the topsoil that the amaranth was feeding on with visible enthusiasm. The red of the seed heads was darker than the previous year, richer. She harvested in September 8,400 pounds of cleaned grain from 6 acres, 1,400 pounds per acre, more than 10 times the yield of the quarter-acre test with old seed, and the protein content, which she had sent to Luella Paget for laboratory analysis, came back at 19.4%, nearly double the protein content of standard grain sorghum, and higher than any dryland amaranth sample in the Institute's database. Luella's note with the results said simply, "The companion planting is the variable. Your father was right." Marge read that line standing at the kitchen counter. She set the note down. She picked up the folding knife from her breast pocket and turned it over in her hands. Her father's knife. The blade worn down 1/8 of an inch from 40 years of cutting seed samples. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried about being right. She was the kind of woman who wrote the number in the notebook and went to bed. But she did write it, 8,400, below the 34 from the year before, in her own handwriting, below her father's. In October 1985, she drove to the extension office and walked to the front counter where Perry Yarbrough was working at a desk behind the partition. She set a paper bag on the counter. She said, 6 acres, 8,400 pounds. I would like to know if you have any contacts for buyers. Yarbrough looked at the bag. He opened it. He looked at the grain inside. Small, copper-colored. He picked some up between his fingers and let it fall back into the bag the way a man handles something he does not recognize and is not sure he wants to. He said, "What is it?" She said, "Amaranth." He said, "We don't have a commodity classification for amaranth." She said, "I know. I'm asking if you know who does." Yarbrough did not have an answer. He looked at the bag for a moment. Then he looked back at Marge with the expression of a man who is certain he is about to explain something important. Something the woman in front of him has not considered. He said, "You can't build a business on a crop that has no market infrastructure. That's the reality." Colt Nesmith was in the waiting area. He had been in the same room 18 months earlier when Yarbrough had told Marge to stop reinventing the wheel. He was holding a seed catalog. He set it down. He said nothing, but he watched. Marge picked up the paper bag. She said, "Thank you for your time." She drove home. She already had a buyer. She had been corresponding for 3 months with a natural foods distributor in Denver, Colorado called Mountain Sun Natural Foods. She had found them through the research network. Luella Paget had given her the name. Mountain Sun was paying 45 cents per pound for cleaned grain amaranth, 3 times the current per pound equivalent of grain sorghum. They needed volume. They said if she could supply 50,000 pounds annually on a firm contract, they would sign a 2-year purchase agreement. To produce 50,000 pounds, she needed approximately 60 acres under production. She had 160. She had the seed. She had the technique. She had the soil amendment program. She had a buyer offering 3 times the commodity price. What she needed was 1 more season. What she got instead was the sound of a connecting rod punching through the engine block of a John Deere 60 tractor on a Tuesday morning in February 1986. She was in the machine shed when it happened. She had started the engine to move the tractor to the north field for a soil check. The engine had been running for 11 minutes. She heard the knock first, a deep metallic sound that did not belong inside any engine she had ever listened to. And then the rod let go. The sound it made was final. A door closing inside the machine that was not going to open again. She turned off the key. She sat on the tractor seat for a moment in the sudden silence. The machine shed smelled of oil and cold metal and the faint sweetness of grain dust. She could see her breath. She climbed down and looked at the engine. She did not need to look long. The oil was already pooling under the block. She could see the crack. The block was done. A rebuilt engine from the Deere dealer in Great Bend cost $4,200. She had $1,870 in her account. The net from the 1985 amaranth sale after cleaning fees and fuel and the new seed stock she had ordered for the 60-acre planting she had spent the entire winter preparing for. She did not call the bank. She called Orrin Dills. Orrin lived in Russell County. He had been her father's mechanic since the early 1950s. He was 71 years old, 6 years retired. He had hands like weathered oak and a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest. somewhere below the surface, somewhere that did not change with the seasons. He drove out on a Saturday morning in early March. He looked at the engine for 20 minutes without saying anything. He crawled under the tractor and looked again. He stood up and wiped his hands on his pants and looked at Marge. He said, "I can pull a rebuilt short block from a 69 in my yard for $600. The rest I can do, but I'll need your help and I'll need a few days." He slept in the farmhouse. He ate whatever Marge cooked, which was mostly pinto beans and cornbread, and sometimes eggs from the 3 hens she kept behind the house. They worked afternoons in the machine shed where the wind came through the gaps in the siding, and the smell of oil and cold metal was constant. Orrin did not talk much. He worked the way her father had worked, with his hands, in silence, with the kind of attention that does not need conversation to sustain itself. But on the 4th evening, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that he held with both hands because the shed had taken the warmth out of his fingers, he said something that changed the shape of everything Marge thought she knew about why her father had stopped growing amaranth. He said, "Your father didn't quit because there was no buyer." Marge looked at him. He said, "In 1949, right after his 3rd season, he found a buyer, a man in Denver, natural foods distributor, small operation. The man drove out to the farm and looked at the grain and said he'd take everything Eldon could produce." Marge set down her coffee. Orrin said Eldon shipped him 400 pounds as a trial lot. The man paid on delivery, said he wanted more, said he could sell everything Eldon could grow. Marge said, "What happened?" Orrin looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has been carrying a piece of information for 34 years and has decided tonight is the night to set it down. He said, "The Grain Dealers Association happened. 2 men from the state association drove out to the buyer in Denver and told him that purchasing unclassified grain from an uncertified producer could jeopardize his dealer's license. They said the USDA had no standard for the product, and any shipment that crossed state lines without a commodity classification could be flagged as a regulatory violation." He paused. He said, "There was no regulation. They made it up. They didn't want a crop they couldn't control moving through channels they didn't own, so they killed it. And your father went back to Milo and wrote it all down in that notebook and never said another word about it." The kitchen was quiet. Marge looked at the tin box on the shelf. The notebook was inside it. 23 pages about a plant that knew how to grow. Written by a man who had been told to stop growing it by the same structure that was still telling her to stop growing it 35 years later. Perry Yarbrough's voice in her head. "You can't build a business on a crop that has no market infrastructure." Her father had built the market in 1949, and the infrastructure had destroyed it. She said, "He never told me." Orrin said, "He told me once in 1952. He said the system wasn't ready for what the plant could do. He said someday it would be." He finished his coffee. He went back to the machine shed. The engine rebuild took 11 days. On a Sunday afternoon in late March 1986, Orrin turned the key on the John Deere 60. It started on the first attempt. It ran with the same low, even rumble it had always had. 33 years of the same sound. The sound of a machine that had been built to do one thing and had never stopped doing it. Orrin wiped his hands on a shop rag. He said, "Your father bought this tractor new. Did you know that?" Marge said, "I know." He said, "Take care of it." He drove back to Russell County. He did not send a bill. Spring planting was 2 weeks late because of the rebuild. The soil was dry and the forecast showed no rain through April. Marge planted 60 acres of amaranth over 2 consecutive days, working 16-hour shifts, eating nothing between sunrise and sunset. The 60 acres included the companion planting rows. Native bee plant alternating with amaranth at 8-inch spacing. Every row measured, every row placed, using the custom spacers she had fabricated in Hoisington 2 years earlier. The soil was too dry for ideal germination, and she knew it. She planted anyway because she had no choice, and because her father had written in the notebook that amaranth was more patient with bad conditions than the farmer planting it was likely to be. 3 weeks later, 4 inches of rain fell in 36 hours, and the amaranth germinated at a density she had not seen in any of her test plots. Uniform close rows, the seedlings pushing through the crust of the drying soil in a line so consistent it looked surveyed. The companion rows of bee plant came up 3 days later, already fixing nitrogen, already doing their work. By June, the field stood thigh-high. By July, it was chest-high. By August, the seed heads had formed in the deep, dark red that she was beginning to understand was the plant's way of saying it had done what it came to do. Garland Mays drove past in July and stopped at the fence. He sat in his truck for a long time, looking at 60 acres of amaranth, which was unlike anything else growing in Barton County, unlike anything else growing in any county in Kansas. The red seed heads moving in the wind like something between a wheat field and a painting of a wheat field that someone had gotten wrong on purpose. He drove away without speaking. The 1986 harvest was 71,400 pounds of cleaned grain. She hauled it in 3 truckloads to a grain cleaning facility in Great Bend. She had contracted at 4 cents per pound. Mountain Sun Natural Foods took delivery in October at 45 cents per pound. The payment was $32,130. On 60 acres, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number for a while. She wrote it in the notebook on the page behind her father's last entry. Below the 8,400, below the 34, 3 numbers, 3 years, each one larger than the one before, each one written in the same hand, her hand, on pages that began in her father's. Then she made coffee and drank it standing at the east window, watching the turned field in the October light. She had done it. Except she hadn't, because Dalton Giddon was not finished. The call came in November from Mountain Sun's accounts manager, a man named Pruitt, who spoke with the flat, careful tone of someone reading from a legal pad. He said, "Mrs. Hollister, we have received correspondence from an individual named Dalton Giddon claiming co-ownership of the Amaranth operation in Barton County. He is requesting that 50% of all payments be redirected to an account in his name. He has provided what he describes as a partnership agreement." Marge was standing in the kitchen. The phone cord stretched across the counter. She could see the north field through the window, turned, clean. The faint reddish cast of amaranth root matter still visible in the soil. She said, "What did you say to him?" Pruitt said, "We have frozen the account pending verification of ownership. We cannot issue further payments until the dispute is resolved." She closed her eyes. $32,130. Frozen. Her only buyer. Frozen. Her entire 1987 planning season dependent on that income. Frozen. Because a man who had stolen $84,000 from her 3 years ago had picked up a telephone and told a stranger in Denver that he owned half of everything she had built since he left. She said, "I will be in your office on Thursday." She drove to Denver, 712 miles each way. She left before dawn on Wednesday morning and arrived at Mountain Sun's warehouse office on Thursday at 9 in the morning with a manila folder on her lap. Inside the folder, the original 1970 partnership agreement, which specified grain sorghum operations only. The land deed showing sole ownership in her name following the partnership dissolution. Her tax returns from 1984 through 1986, showing all Amaranth income reported under her individual filing. A copy of the Barton County Property Tax Assessment, and a letter from First Central Bank of Great Bend confirming that no active partnership existed on the property. She sat across from Pruitt and his supervisor and laid the documents on the table one at a time. She did not explain. She did not argue. She did not say anything about Dalton Giddon's character or his history or what he had done to her in October 1983. She let the paper speak, because paper does not raise its voice. Paper does not get angry. Paper sits on a table and says what it says, and the person reading it either believes it or does not. They believed it. Mountain Sun unfroze the account, confirmed Marge as the sole supplier, issued the held payment within 2 weeks. She drove the 712 miles home. She did not stop except for fuel. Marge expanded to 140 acres for the 1987 season. She negotiated a firm contract with Mountain Sun and began correspondence with a second buyer, Northland Mills in Minneapolis, a food manufacturer expanding its specialty grain line as health food retail grew on both coasts. The per-pound price was rising, 52 cents now, because the natural foods market was growing and competing supply remained thin, because almost nobody in the country was producing grain amaranth at commercial scale, because almost nobody knew it existed. And then The co-op vote happened. Perry Yarbrough did not mean to do it. She believed that. She believed he was a man who did what he thought was right. And sometimes what he thought was right was wrong, and he did not always know the difference. In January 1987, at a regional extension meeting in Wichita, he had presented data from Barton County's agricultural output for the previous 3 years, and he had included, without naming her, without intending harm, a line item showing yield and income from what he described as an alternative dryland crop trial on a 140-acre parcel. He had not said amaranth. He had not said Hollister. But in a county where 140 acres is a specific size and alternative dryland crop trial describes exactly one operation, and everyone in the room knew whose land was 140 acres. He might as well have written her name on the projector slide. The data reached the Barton County Co-op Board by February, and the co-op board included 2 men, Warren Caulfield and Lou Hatchett, who had known Dalton Giddon for years, who still spoke with him occasionally, who had their own opinions about a woman farming alone and growing something that was not in any binder at any extension office in the state. The vote was held in March. 7 board members, 4 present. Caulfield and Hatchett moved to revoke Marge's co-op membership on the grounds that her primary crop was not a classified commodity grain and therefore did not meet the cooperative's membership standards. The motion passed 3-1. The one dissenting vote was a young alfalfa farmer from Ellenwood who did not know Marge personally, but thought the motion smelled wrong. He was outvoted. He did not speak to Marge afterward because he did not know her. But he wrote the word wrong on his copy of the meeting minutes and underlined it twice. Losing the co-op meant losing access to the grain elevator in Great Bend, losing the fuel discount that co-op members received at the Cenex station on Highway 56, losing the equipment sharing pool, losing the network of buyers and suppliers and logistics that every small farmer in Barton County depended on to operate at a viable margin. Marge learned about the vote on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the machine shed checking the row spacers on the cultivator when Colt Nesmith drove up the gravel driveway. He had heard about it at the feed store in Claflin. He stood in the shed doorway with his hat in his hands and told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. He said, "It's not right." She said, "No." He said, "What are you going to do?" She set down the wrench she was holding. She looked at the John Deere 60. At the engine, Orrin Dills had rebuilt in 11 days. At the maintenance log hanging from a nail on the wall above the workbench. She said, "The same thing I've been doing, without the co-op," which meant building her own logistics from nothing. Again, she contracted directly with the grain cleaning facility in Great Bend. 4 cents per pound. No co-op discount. She bought fuel at retail price. Full price. She hired a trucking service for the Denver and Minneapolis hauls instead of using the co-op's shared fleet. Every cost went up. Every margin went down. But 45 cents per pound for amaranth was still 3 times the per pound price of Milo. And even with the increased costs, even with the co-op's exclusion, even with Dalton Giddon's shadow falling across everything she did from a distance of 200 miles, The math still worked, because the math had never depended on the system. The math depended on the plant, and the plant did not care who was a member of the co-op. The plant grew because the soil was right, and the technique was right, and the woman working the ground above it was paying attention. Marge planted 140 acres in April 1987, alone, without the co-op, without help, without anyone telling her it was possible. Because the people whose job it was to tell her what was possible had spent 4 years telling her it wasn't. The harvest came in at 172,000 pounds. She was in the kitchen on a December evening. The fields were turned. The payments from Mountain Sun and the preliminary agreement with Northland Mills were in the bank. She was writing the yield figures in the notebook, her father's notebook. 34, 8,400, 71,400, 172,000. 4 numbers, 4 years. Each one written below the one before, in a column that climbed the page the way the plant climbed out of the ground every spring. The phone rang. It was not Laureen. It was not Mountain Sun. It was not Perry Yarbrough or Colt Nesmith or anyone she expected. It was a process server from the Barton County Courthouse informing her that a civil complaint had been filed against her by Dalton R. Giddon. Case number 87-CV-4418, seeking 50% of all revenue generated from agricultural operations on the Hollister property from January 1984 through the present date, seeking an equitable interest in the land itself, citing a partnership agreement that he claimed covered all agricultural activities conducted on the shared property during and after the term of the partnership. Total damages sought, $180,000. Marge hung up the phone. She stood in the kitchen. She looked at the notebook open on the table. She looked at the numbers she had just written. She looked at the tin box on the shelf with her father's green composition notebook inside it, the one with the water-damaged corners, the one that said, "Do not tell the partner." She looked out the window. The north field was dark. The turned earth was invisible, but she knew it was there. 160 acres of ground that had been in her family since 1946. Ground that her father had carried seeds across a state to plant. Ground that she had composted by hand at 4 a.m. in January. Ground that had grown something the entire agricultural establishment of Kansas said could not be grown commercially. Dalton Giddon wanted half of it. She closed the notebook. She put it in the tin box. She put the tin box back on the shelf. She turned off the kitchen light. She did not call Laureen. She did not call anyone. She went to bed. Because there was nothing to decide. She had been making decisions for 4 years. Selling equipment, composting in the dark, fabricating row spacers, driving to Denver alone, building logistics from nothing after the co-op shut her out. Every decision had been hers. Every risk had been hers. Every morning in the cold and every evening in the kitchen, writing numbers in a notebook, had been hers. And this was going to be hers too. She spent the winter preparing. Not the way a person prepares for a trial by hiring experts and rehearsing testimony and building a case that costs money she did not have. She prepared the way she prepared soil, methodically, layer by layer, starting with what was already there and working it until the structure was right. The 1988 harvest had come in before the trial. 140 acres. 187,000 pounds of cleaned grain amaranth. The contract payments from Mountain Sun Natural Foods and the secondary agreement with Northland Mills in Minneapolis totaled $109,600. She had driven to First Central Bank of Great Bend on a Wednesday morning in November 1988 and handed the check to Estes. He was 5 years older now. The striped tie was the same, but the soft handshake had firmed up over the years, the way things firm up when you watch enough people sit across your desk and show you what they are made of. He looked at the amount on the check. He looked at the memo line, which said, Grain Amaranth, Barton County. He said, Marge, I didn't know anyone was growing this commercially here. She said, they weren't. He looked at her for a moment, the way you look at someone you have known for 5 years and realize you have not been paying close enough attention. He said, I see that, but the money was frozen. All of it. The court had issued a temporary hold on all accounts associated with the Hollister property pending resolution of Giddens' civil complaint. $109,600 sitting in an account she could see but could not touch. Like rain falling on the other side of a fence. She could not afford a good lawyer. She knew this. A good agricultural property attorney in central Kansas charged $200 an hour, and the case Giddens had constructed was not simple. It was designed to look complicated, designed to require exactly the kind of expensive legal response that a woman operating on thin margins after 5 years of building something from nothing could not afford. Which was the point. That was always the point with Dalton Giddens. He did not need to win. He needed her to run out of money trying not to lose. Colt Nesmith drove out to the farm on a Saturday in January. He had been watching the situation from Claflin, hearing things at the feed store, doing his own arithmetic the way he had been doing his own arithmetic since that first morning in the extension office waiting room in 1983. He said, I know a lawyer in Great Bend, young, not expensive. She handles agricultural disputes. Marge said, I don't need someone to argue the case. I need someone to file the papers and stand next to me while I argue it myself. Colt looked at her. She said, I know what I have. I know where it is. I know what it proves. I just need someone who knows which forms to fill out. He gave her the name. The lawyer was named Darcy Whitlow, 29 years old, 2 years out of Washburn Law. She had an office above a hardware store on Main Street in Great Bend, and she charged $60 an hour, and she listened to Marge for 45 minutes without interrupting, and then said, You're going to win this, but you need to understand that the way you win it matters as much as winning it. Marge said, What do you mean? Darcy said, Giddens' case is built on confusion. He wants the judge to see a complicated partnership dispute that requires months of discovery and depositions and expert testimony. The more complicated it looks, the more it costs you, and the longer your money stays frozen. Your job is to make it simple. Simple enough that a judge looks at it and sees a man who stole from a woman and came back for more. Marge spent February and March organizing. She cleared the kitchen table. She laid out every piece of paper she had kept since 1970. Every receipt, every ledger entry, every letter, every contract, the partnership agreement, the dissolution paperwork, the tax returns, the equipment sales from the winter of 1984, the compost sales, the correspondence with the Research Institute, the Mountain Sun contract, the Northland Mills agreement, the maintenance log from the John Deere 60, the separate ledger she had started when she began paying down Giddens' equipment loan, and the notebook, her father's green composition notebook with the water-damaged corners. She organized it chronologically. She made copies of everything. She put the copies in a 3-ring binder with tabs. She labeled each tab in her own handwriting. Clear. Plain. The way you label something when you want a stranger to understand it without explanation. She did not rehearse what she would say. She did not write a speech. She had been living this story for 5 years. She did not need to practice it. She needed to tell it. And the difference between practicing a story and telling one is the difference between reading about soil and putting your hands in it. The trial was held on a Tuesday morning in March 1989 at the Barton County District Courthouse in Great Bend. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old wood, and the particular staleness of a room that has heard too many arguments and not enough truth. Marge wore the same clothes she wore to the extension office, the same clothes she wore to the bank, the same clothes she wore to the field. Because she owned one set of good clothes, and they were good enough for any room she walked into. Dalton Giddens sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer from Hutchinson, a man in a gray suit who had the careful posture of someone being paid by the hour and aware of it. Giddens himself looked the same as he had looked in 1983. Pressed shirt, clean hands. The easy confidence of a man who had always believed that looking competent was the same thing as being competent. He did not look at Marge when she entered. She noticed. Giddens' lawyer presented the case first. The argument was built on a single document, a 1-page addendum to the 1970 partnership agreement, dated 1980. It expanded the scope of the partnership from grain sorghum operations to, and the lawyer read this part slowly, to ensure the judge heard every word. All agricultural activities conducted on the shared property during and subsequent to the term of the partnership. The document had 2 signatures at the bottom, Dalton R. Giddens and Marjorie E. Hollister. Marge looked at the signature that was supposed to be hers. It was close. It was very close. The slant was right. The spacing was approximately right. The way the M connected to the A in Marjorie was almost exactly how she wrote it. Almost. Giddens' lawyer argued that the addendum proved Marge's Amaranth operation fell within the partnership's scope, that Giddens was entitled to 50% of all revenue, that the land itself should be subject to equitable division, that $180,000 in damages was a conservative estimate of what his client was owed. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was thorough. He was organized. He was confident. And he was building his entire case on a piece of paper that did not exist in 1980. Marge knew this because she knew something Dalton Giddens did not know she knew. Darcy Whitlow stood and said, "Your Honor, the respondent would like to present 3 items of evidence." 3 items. That was all. 40 minutes of argument answered with 3 pieces of paper. And the woman who had prepared them. The first item was the original 1970 partnership agreement. Not a copy, the original, with both signatures, and in the margin, in handwriting that Marge had known was there since October 1983, when she had sat at the kitchen table reading her father's notebook and then gone back to the partnership papers in the same tin box. Her father's handwriting, Eldon Hollister's, as witness to the signing, and next to his signature, a notation. Partnership scope grain sorghum operations only, per discussion with both parties. E. Hollister, October 8, 1970. Eldon Hollister had been dead for 18 years, but his handwriting was still in the room, still saying what he had said, still witnessing what he had witnessed. The dead do not testify in courts of law, but their handwriting does. And Eldon's handwriting said the partnership had been limited to grain sorghum. In 1970, in ink, in the margin of the document that Dalton Giddens' lawyer had just spent 40 minutes trying to expand. The second item was Marge's personal ledger, the one she had started in November 1983. Every expense related to the Amaranth operation recorded in her own hand. Every seed purchase, every fuel cost, every cleaning fee, every compost input, every equipment repair. 5 years of entries, hundreds of line items, every single one funded from her personal income or from Amaranth sales. Not $1 from the partnership account, not $1 from shared funds, because there had been no shared funds, because Dalton Giddens had taken them all. And the third item was a document Marge had requested from First Central Bank of Great Bend. A certified copy of the original 1970 partnership agreement as filed with the bank at the time the joint operating account was opened. The bank's copy, which Dalton Giddens did not know existed. Because when you are the partner who handles the banking, you assume you are the partner who controls the records. Except banks keep their own copies. They keep them in vaults. They keep them for decades. And when a woman walks into the branch and asks the manager to pull the original filing from 1970, the manager pulls it because he has watched that woman pay off a $38,000 debt she did not incur and build a $109,000 operation from $11.40. And he has decided, quietly, without saying it, that she is the most reliable person who has ever sat across his desk. The bank's copy of the 1970 agreement matched Marge's original exactly. Grain sorghum operations only. Eldon Hollister's witness signature in the margin. No addendum, no amendment, no 1980 expansion, which meant the document Dalton Giddens' lawyer had presented, the one-page addendum with the signature that looked almost exactly like Marge's, did not correspond to any document in the bank's records, had never been filed, had never been referenced, had never existed until Dalton Giddens needed it to exist. Darcy Whitlow did not call it a forgery. She did not need to. She laid the three documents side by side on the table in front of the judge and said, "Your Honor, the respondent has no further evidence to present." The judge looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Dalton Giddens. Giddens' lawyer asked for a recess. The judge denied it. Giddens' lawyer asked to examine the bank's copy. The judge allowed it. The lawyer held the document for several minutes. He set it down. He leaned over to Giddens and said something that no one else in the courtroom could hear. Giddens' face did not change, but his hands did. They moved from the table to his lap, hands looking for a place to hide. The judge ruled from the bench. He did not take the case under advisement. He did not schedule a second hearing. He said the plaintiff's claim was unsupported by any credible evidence. He said the 1980 addendum was inconsistent with the bank's records and the original agreement and the witness notation. He dismissed the case with prejudice, which meant it could not be refiled, which meant it was over. And then he said one more thing. He said he was referring the matter of the 1980 addendum to the county prosecutor's office for investigation of potential document fraud. Dalton Giddens stood up from the plaintiff's table. He buttoned his jacket. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Marge. He had not looked at her once during the entire proceeding. She noticed that too. The frozen accounts were released within 2 weeks. $109,600 in her account. Accessible. Real. She drove home from the bank. She stopped at Decker Hardware on Main Street and bought a replacement blade for the folding knife her father had carried since the 1940s. The old blade was worn down 1/8 of an inch from 40 years of cutting seed samples. She replaced it in the parking lot, put the knife back in her breast pocket, and drove home. That evening, she called Lorene. Lorene was the only person who had known everything from the beginning. From the 23 minutes in the truck, from the October morning in 1983, when the number on the screen was 0 and the number should have been $84,200. Marge said, "It worked out." Lorene said, "Good." Marge said, 6 years. Lorene said, "I know." That was the extent of it. 2 women, sisters, who had learned a long time ago that the important things do not require many words. They require the right ones. Word moved through Barton County the way word moves in a county that size. Not through the newspaper, not dramatically, but at the grain elevator in Great Bend, at the co-op meeting in Ellenwood, Across the counter at the feed store in Claflin, the number traveled ahead of the explanation. $109,000 on 140 acres. A crop that has no commodity classification. A woman who was told she could not build a business on it by a man at a desk with a 3-ring binder. Perry Yarbrough heard the number from Colt Nesmith in December 1988 at the feed store. Colt said it plainly. The way you say something you have been waiting to say for 5 years. 109,000 on 140 acres. Crop that has no commodity class. Yarbrough said, that can't be right. Colt said, drive out there. Yarbrough drove out on a Thursday morning. The fields were cleared and turned. A light, dry snow was falling, not heavy enough to accumulate, just heavy enough to remind you that winter is a thing that happens whether you are ready for it or not. He stood at the edge of the north field and looked at the turned earth, which still held the faint reddish cast of amaranth root matter, a color that had no name in any soil survey Yarbrough had encountered in his training. A color that existed only because something had been grown in this ground that his training had told him could not be grown here, commercially, profitably, by a woman working alone with a tractor older than he was. He asked Marge to walk him through it. She walked him through it from the beginning. The germination tests in 1983. The 19-year-old seed, the quarter-acre test, the correspondence with the Research Institute, the companion planting technique from her father's notebook, the custom row spacers machined in Hoisington, the compost amendment program, the Denver contract and the Minneapolis contract, and the price differential that made 60 acres of amaranth return more than 100 acres of milo at any price milo was likely to reach in the foreseeable future. She presented it as a sequence of decisions, each following logically from the evidence that preceded it, without editorializing, without emphasis, without the tone of a woman who had been right when the man standing in front of her had been wrong, because that tone would have been satisfying, and satisfaction was not what this moment required. What this moment required was information, clear, transferable, usable by the next person who stood in a field and wondered what else the ground could do. Yarbrough stood with his arms crossed in the cold for a long time. Snow had begun to settle on the turned rows, on his shoulders, on the brim of his cap. He said, "I told you there was no market for this." She said, "You did." He said, "I was wrong about that." The field held that between them for a moment, the way a field holds everything, without judgment, without opinion, just holding it. He said, "I need to understand this crop well enough to advise producers on it." Marge reached into her coat pocket and produced a photocopy of the 1982 research paper from the Tillman Institute, the same one she had found at the county library, the same one she had carried in her father's notebook for 5 years. She held it out. Yarbrough took it with both hands. The way you take something you should have asked for a long time before. 3 months later, Colt Nesmith drove out to the farm on a Sunday afternoon. He brought a box, cardboard, sealed with packing tape. He set it on the kitchen table and stood there with his hat in his hands, the way he always stood in Marge's kitchen. Comfortable being there, but not wanting to presume. He said, "I have to show you something." Marge said, "What is it?" He said, "Do you remember the first time I saw you in the extension office in 1983? When Perry told you to stop reinventing the wheel?" She said, "I remember." He said, "I was 26 years old. I had a seed catalog on my knee. I was there to ask about soybean varieties. And I heard Perry tell a woman with 38 years of experience on her own land that she didn't need to reinvent the wheel. And something about the way you looked at him, not angry, not defeated, just certain. The way a person looks when she already knows the answer and has decided not to waste time arguing with someone who doesn't. He opened the box. Inside were notebooks, 5 of them, spiral bound, each one labeled by year: 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987. He said, "I started writing everything down that day. I drove past your fields every month. I talked to the people who talked to you. I recorded the yields you brought to the extension office. I wrote down what Perry said and what you said and what the numbers were every season. I sent it to the state university last year, the Department of Agronomy." Marge looked at the notebooks. She looked at Colt. He said, "They published it, a 7-page extension bulletin, grain amaranth as a viable dryland alternative crop for central and south-central Kansas. It cites yield and income data from a 140-acre operation in Barton County." Marge picked up one of the notebooks. She opened it. Colt's handwriting was neat, organized, each entry dated, each observation specific. 5 years of watching, 5 years of quiet attention paid by a young man in a waiting room who had recognized something in a woman's face that the credentialed man behind the desk had missed entirely. She said, "Does it have my name in it?" He said, "It does. In the acknowledgments." She said, "Take it out." He looked at her. She said, "Write what the plant does. Leave me out of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The bulletin was published later that year. It did not name Marge Hollister. It described the operation, the soil conditions, the companion planting methodology, the yield data, the price differentials, the amino acid profiles confirmed by laboratory analysis. 7 pages of evidence that a crop the agricultural establishment of Kansas had never acknowledged was producing returns that the agricultural establishment of Kansas could not explain within its existing framework. Perry Yarbrough amended the Barton County Extension Office's alternative crop reference binder that same year, adding grain amaranth as a certified viable option for low-rainfall dryland producers. He visited the Hollister operation twice during the growing season to observe field management practices. He brought a clipboard. He asked questions without pretending he had not needed to ask them. Colt Nesmith planted 22 acres of amaranth in Stafford County in 1990, using seed sourced from Marge's surplus, using the row spacing calibration she had shown him, using the companion planting technique from Eldon Hollister's notebook, replicated on different soil, in a different county, by a different farmer. The yield was 1,310 pounds per acre. Within 8% of Marge's results, 2 other producers in Rice County followed the season after. A natural foods purchasing cooperative in Lawrence, Kansas, added Kansas-grown amaranth to its 1991 catalog. In the fall of 1989, a reporter from a Wichita newspaper drove out to the Hollister farm and knocked on the kitchen door. He had a camera and a notepad and the specific energy of a man who believed he had found a story that would write itself. Marge opened the door. She looked at the camera. She looked at the notepad. She said, "I'm not doing an interview." She said it without particular feeling. The way you close a gate that does not need to be open. She closed the door. The reporter stood on the porch steps for a moment. Then he drove away. The story he had planned to write was never filed. In 1990, a Northland Mills representative drove down from Minneapolis with a contract offer. 500,000 pounds annually, 58 cents per pound, 5-year term. The kind of contract that requires hired labor and leased equipment and debt and a scale of operation that changes the nature of what you are doing from farming into something else. Something that looks like farming from the outside, but feels like banking from the inside. Marge read the contract at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She called Laureen. She said, "They want 500,000 pounds. Laureen said, "Can you produce it?" She said, "Not without debt and hired labor." Laureen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then you know the answer." She did. She declined. She renegotiated a 3-year term at 200,000 pounds per year, a volume she could reach on existing acreage without expanding her debt position or changing the nature of the operation. Without hiring anyone, without leasing equipment, without borrowing against the land her father had left her free and clear. The representative said as he was getting into his car, "You understand you're leaving significant revenue on the table." Marge was standing on the porch, the same porch where she had closed the door on the reporter, the same porch she had stood on every morning for 38 years looking at the same fields. She said, "I'm doing what I can do correctly." She walked back inside and started supper. In October of 1994, her nephew Tate drove out from Wichita and stayed. He was 23 years old, 2 years of business school at Wichita State before he stopped. Not because he had failed, because what they were teaching him was not what he wanted to learn. And he did not yet know what he wanted to learn until he drove out to his aunt's farm on a Saturday in early October and walked the north field with her before 7 in the morning and felt something shift inside him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite succeed. He was Laureen's son, the only member of the family besides Laureen who had ever expressed any interest in the farm. He had come out on weekends as a teenager. He had ridden on the John Deere 60 when he was 12. He knew the sound of the engine the way you know the sound of a voice that was present in your childhood. Not from memory, from the body. Marge did not explain the operation all at once. She walked him through it over 3 weeks, a section at a time. Soil amendment schedules, row spacing calibration, the moisture thresholds for planting, the companion planting cycle, and why the native bee plant had to go in at the same time as the amaranth and not a day later, the cleaning contracts and their renegotiation schedule, the buyer relationships and how they had been built through correspondence, not calls. Letters. Because a letter is a document, and a document is a record, and a record is the only thing that stands up when someone tries to take what you built. She said that last part once, standing at the edge of the north field. She did not explain it further. She did not need to. Tate had heard enough of the story from his mother to know what it meant. Each morning, they walked the fields before 7. Marge pointed at things without saying more than what the fields required. The soil color here, the drainage pattern there, the place where the wind consistently deposited moisture along the western tree line, the section in the southeast corner where the topsoil was thinner and the companion planting needed to be adjusted to compensate. She taught the way her father had taught, by showing, not by lecturing, by standing in the field and letting the field do the talking. One afternoon in late October, she sent Tate to the machine shed to start the John Deere 60 and bring it around to the north field. He came back on foot. He said, "Aunt Marge, why are we running that machine? It's 41 years old. We could lease a newer tractor for less than what we spend on parts and maintenance every year." Marge was recalibrating the row spacers on the cultivator attachment, working with a 1/4-inch wrench and a spacing gauge she had made from a piece of angle iron. She did not look up. She said, "What would you lose if you leased?" Tate thought about it. He said, "Nothing I can think of." She said, "You'd lose the understanding of what that specific machine needs. If you lease it, you call someone when it fails. If you own it and maintain it, you know what it is before it fails. That's a different kind of knowledge." Tate said, "It's still just a tractor." Marge set down the wrench. She went into the machine shed. She came back with the maintenance log, a spiral-bound notebook, hanging from a nail on the wall since 1971. Every service entry, every part number, every repair, written in her own hand for 18 years. And before that, in her father's hand from 1953. 2 handwritings, 2 lifetimes, 1 machine. She handed it to Tate without saying anything. He stood in the field and read through several pages. He read the entries from 1953 in his grandfather's handwriting, describing the machine when it was new, the way the clutch engaged, the way the throttle responded at low RPM, the first oil change at 20 hours, the observations of a man who had just bought the most important piece of equipment he would ever own and was paying attention to it the way you pay attention to something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. He looked at the tractor. 41 years old. Engine rebuilt in 11 days by a 71-year-old mechanic who did not send a bill. Still running. He looked at the log. He looked at the two handwritings, his grandfather's, his aunt's, and the blank space below the last entry. After that, he started the John Deere 60 on the 1st of every month, winter included. He checked the oil and coolant. He recorded it in the logbook, in his own handwriting, below his aunt's. In the spring of 1995, Tate planted his first full season of amaranth on the North 40 acres. He had run his own soil tests in February using the methodology Marge had taught him. He had arrived at his own planting date calculation independently. He had prepared the companion planting rows himself, measuring the spacing with the angle iron gauge Marge had fabricated, checking it twice. The way she checked it, his yield that fall, 53,000 pounds from 40 acres, was marginally higher per acre than Marge's had been at the equivalent stage of her own operation, 11 years earlier. Marge looked at the yield figure. She wrote it in the notebook, below her own numbers, in her own hand. She did not comment. She handed the notebook back. That winter, she showed Tate the green composition notebook for the first time. Her father's, the one with the water-damaged corners. The one that had been in the tin box on the kitchen shelf for 24 years. She had never shown it to anyone except the judge at the trial and Darcy Whitlow in the weeks before. Tate read through all of it, slowly. The way you read something that was written before you were born by someone you never met, who somehow knew you were coming. He read the 23 pages about amaranth carefully. The rainfall notes, the germination percentages, the companion planting instructions, the line from 1968 about protein enhancement, the warning about the partner. He read the line from 1964 twice. The plant knows how to grow. The problem is people don't know what it is. He looked up. He said, "By the time you were done, did people know what it was?" Marge was standing at the kitchen counter. The afternoon light was coming through the east window. The tin box was open on the shelf. The folding knife was in her breast pocket. The same knife. New blade. Same pocket. She said, "Some of them." In October 1998, Marjorie Hollister walked the North Field in the same way she had walked it every October since she was 12 years old. In the early morning, before the wind picked up, when the turned rows were still dark with overnight moisture, and the light was the color it only gets in Kansas in October. Low, warm. The ground looked like it was remembering something. The field was cleared. The stalks were turned under. The soil held the faint reddish cast that amaranth root matter leaves behind. A color she had never found a name for in any soil survey. A color that existed because her father had carried seed from New Mexico in 1946. and planted it and watched it grow and written down what he saw and put the notebook in a tin box and trusted that someone would find it. She was 77 years old. She pressed 2 fingers into the turned earth at the center of the field, feeling the moisture, the particle structure, the way the soil held together briefly and then fell apart between her fingers, the way it had always done, the way her father had shown her when she was a girl, and he had learned it from someone who carried no credentials and held no appointments and had access to none of the institutional frameworks that defined in their terms what was possible and what was not. The John Deere 60 stood in the open bay of the machine shed, where it had stood through 45 growing seasons. Tate had serviced it the first week of October, as he did every month, and recorded the service in the logbook in the neat, close handwriting he had developed over 4 years of keeping it. The tractor was 45 years old. Its engine, rebuilt in 11 days in a cold machine shed in 1986 by a 71-year-old mechanic who did not send a bill, ran without hesitation. Dalton Giddon had been back in Kansas since 1991. He ran a small accounting firm in Hutchinson, south on Highway 96. Marge had not seen him. There was no resolution to be sought there. What Giddon had taken, $84,200 in October 1983, had not been replaced. It had been made irrelevant by a different calculation. The way a wound becomes irrelevant to a woman who has had to learn to walk differently and discovers the new gait covers more ground. That was not forgiveness, it was arithmetic. What remained in the tin box on the kitchen shelf was her father's green notebook with the water-damaged corners, and Luella Paget's handwritten note from the Research Institute, and the original Mountain Sun Natural Foods purchase agreement from 1986, and a single dry amaranth seed head from the first plant Marge had harvested in August 1984, folded inside a piece of wax paper, never labeled. There was no need to label it. Everyone who would ever open that box would already know what it was. The land did not remember Dalton Giddon. Soil does not record betrayal. It records what has been grown in it, what has been returned to it, what the following season's growth will have to work with. That is the full extent of its memory. And in that respect, it is more precise than most of what surrounds it. What Marjorie Hollister built was not built on the defeat of a man who had wronged her. It was built on a piece of knowledge her father had committed to paper in 1963, in a composition notebook that the agricultural establishment of the 1980s had no framework to recognize, let alone value. A knowledge so specific and so far outside the commodity structure that a woman with $11.40 could hold it in her hands and find that it was still, improbably, enough. The plant knew how to grow. It had always known. The only variable, in 1946 and in 1984, and in every season that followed, was whether anyone working the ground above it was paying close enough attention to let it